Welcome to another episode of our video series of the Philosophical History with Contemporary Critique.
It's great to be here. Looking at these sources, it feels less like studying one person and more like trying to understand a whole intellectual civilization. How are you feeling about it?
I'm blown away, really. We're about to explore the system of the philosopher, who for something like 2,000 years was just known as the authority. The sources our listeners sent cover his physics, his ethics, literary theory. It's not just a collection of ideas, it's a complete worldview.
And that's really our mission here, isn't it? To try and understand the sheer scope and, maybe more importantly, the staying power of that intellectual universe. Why did this one thinker manage to systematize knowledge in a way that just commanded respect across entire civilizations?
Okay, let's unpack this. I think to start, we have to appreciate where he came from. We hear a lot about his teacher's aristocratic background, but the sources are pretty clear that this philosopher, he was a man of significant means himself, right?
Well, absolutely. While his teacher had the lineage, the royalty connection, this philosopher's family was very well off. His father was a palace doctor, which is a huge deal.
Okay.
And we have records, things like the wills that Diogenes Laertius preserve that show his family owned a lot of property.
Yeah.
And that context it's vital. You just can't produce intellectual work on this scale without some level of economic security.
That security lets you build things, structures, and that structures, it's the key to why we can even talk about him today.
Precisely. His teacher created the academy, which was revolutionary. But this philosopher later founded the Lyceum. And that was, it was more than a school, it was a blueprint.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me, the power of institutions. What was it about the Lyceum that made his ideas survive when so many others just vanished?
It was the system. The Lyceum systematized everything. They had, consistent student enrollment. That meant they needed a reliable secretarial staff, scribes, a whole apparatus for copying, classifying, and preserving texts.
So it wasn't just relying on a rich student to remember to copy a scroll?
Exactly. He created an intellectual machine that was, in a way, designed for immortality.
And you can see the proof in just the sheer volume of work that survived. The sources say we have about 1 million words of his work.
1 million, compared to maybe 600,000 from his teacher. That difference isn't just about who wrote more, it's about the resilience of the institution he built.
It's a lesson in how ideas actually survive. It's not just about brilliance.
It's about infrastructure. And that brings us to the very idea of brilliance, or genius.
Which didn't really exist then.
Not in our modern post-romantic sense. That idea of the lone, divinely inspired genius that came much, much later. What they valued was systematic thought, rational construction. He wasn't seen as a visionary getting downloads from the heavens. He was seen as the ultimate system builder.
So let's get into the biggest system he built, the universe itself. The absolute foundation of his physics is this total split in the cosmos, above the moon and below the moon. This dualism is everything.
It really is. It dictates the rules for everything. The realm above the moon, the supralunar, that's the realm of perfection. So you have the stars, the planets, the sun. They all move in these perfect, regular, unending circles.
And they're not made of the same stuff as us, right? It's something different.
Completely different. That whole realm is made of a fifth element, ether. It's perfect. It's unchanging. And the motion itself isn't. It's not like a rocket engine pushing them. It's more of a metaphysical thing, like a metaphorical love for a perfect, unmoved deity at the very edge of everything.
So motion up there is perfect, circular, eternal. But the second you cross that boundary, the lunar boundary, and you come down here to the sublunar realm, our realm, it all falls apart.
Everything changes. It all becomes imperfect. Motion down here is linear. It has a start and it has an end. It's all about change, decay, exhaustion. You throw a stone, it flies for a bit, but it has to stop. It wants to go to its natural place.
Which for him was the center of the universe, the Earth.
Exactly. And, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this split cosmos was the great intellectual wall that modern science had to break down.
Right. This is what Newton had to overcome.
Absolutely. Sir Isaac Newton's greatest achievement, maybe, was his universal law of gravitation. He showed that the exact same mathematical force that makes a soda cap fall to the floor also governs the orbit of Saturn.
He unified the two realms.
He destroyed the separation. He showed that heaven and earth play by the same set of rules. And this thinker couldn't even conceive of that because in his world, in our sublunar world, motion always, always stops.
A boomerang is thrown and it comes to rest.
Precisely. because motion always ceases. A perpetual motion machine, a perpetual mobile, is fundamentally impossible on Earth. His whole physics is teleological. Everything has a goal, an end state, and that end state is rest. And that's the idea his successors had to fight against for centuries.
So within our messy, imperfect, sublunar world, everything is dictated by the four elements. Let's walk through that hierarchy.
It's just so elegant. You have earth, water, air, and fire, and they're arranged by their natural places. Earth, well, it wants to go down. Fire wants to go up.
And water sits on top of earth, and air sits on top of water.
Right, and it explains so much, so simply. Smoke rises, stones fall. It works.
And these elements, they're not like atoms. They're generated by combining four primary qualities.
Yes, it's an amazing piece of systematic thinking, all built on what you can see and feel. You combine hot and dry, you get fire. Hot and moist, that gives you air. Cold and moist is water, and cold and dry is earth. It's a purely qualitative physics.
That's a crucial distinction, isn't it? Qualitative versus quantitative. Math wasn't the main tool for explaining our world because you're dealing with qualities like hotness and dryness.
Exactly. You experience these things. You don't necessarily measure them with numbers. And that's why it took people like Galileo and Kepler, who insisted that the universe must be written in the language of mathematics, to change everything.
But this qualitative system had a huge, long-lasting impact, especially in medicine.
Oh, for 2,000 years. This four-element concept, the Anasuri or Erba, it became the foundation of medical theory, all through the classical world, and then into Islamic and Ottoman medicine.
Because the four elements corresponded to the four bodily fluids, the humors.
The Alata Erba, yes.
Yeah.
Yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. And your temperament, your mizaj, which literally means mixture in Arabic, was just the balance of these fluids.
So if you had too much black bile,
you were melancholic.
Mm-hmm.
The word comes directly from this system.
Yeah.
And it was so powerful because it explained everything: health, sickness, psychology, even the changing seasons. It was a complete unified theory of terrestrial life long before anyone dreamed of a periodic table.
Its explanatory power was it was too good to replace for a very long time. So let's turn that same lens on life itself. If this world is all about linear processes and exhaustion, how does life, fit in?
Life is the one thing that sort of cheats. It resists that rule of exhaustion because it loops back on itself through reproduction. Birth, then death. But before death, you produce offspring, and the whole linear process starts over.
He also had this idea that every species was basically perfectly adapted.
Yes, optimal. Every feature, claws, teeth, tails, was perfectly suited for its environment. And that's why his argument with Empedocles about teeth is so telling.
He gets so close to evolutionary thought, but then he pulls back. What happens in that debate?
Well, Empedocles had this proto-evolutionary idea that maybe creatures developed randomly, and only the ones that got lucky with useful parts survived. But this philosopher looked at, say, molars, and he saw their consistent shape across so many different species. He said, look at this regularity. That can't be chance. It has to be purposeful. It has to be for a reason.
So if he saw purpose and perfection, what did he miss? Why no evolution?
The problem was one of scale and the assumption of a static world. He believed the world was eternal, yes, but that the environment itself didn't change. And if the environment never changes, there's no pressure for a species to adapt. The form is already optimal for that unchanging world.
So no need for natural selection.
Exactly. His teleology, that idea that everything has an inherent goal, it locked the door on the randomness and deep time required for Darwin's theory.
Okay, let's shift gears completely to what might be his single most important philosophical idea: potentiality and actuality. Juve and feel.
This is an intellectual tool that just changed everything. It gives you a language for talking about change and being, not just what something is, but what it can become.
The classic example is the seed and the tree, but I love the train analogy you brought up.
It's so useful. A seed is potentially a tree. The tree is the actuality of that potential. But think about a train going from Istanbul to Ankara. Right now, it is actually in Eskişehir, but it is potentially in Ankara. By creating these two modes of being, he could define motion without using circular logic.
So motion isn't flow or transition because those words already assume motion is happening.
Right. Motion is simply the actuality of a potentiality. It is the process of the potential being realized. A block of marble is potentially a statue. The sculptor's work is the process of actualization. It gave philosophy a whole new, precise vocabulary.
And he applied this systematic thinking even to art. In his Poetics, he treats writing a tragedy like it's an engineering problem.
He completely rejects the idea of some divine mystical inspiration. For him, a good tragedy is an objective mechanism, a structure. He wanted to find the rules for what makes it effective.
And the main rule is that balance between necessity and surprise.
Yes, the plot has to feel inevitable, like fate. But the events themselves still need to be shocking. Think of Oedipus. The final reveal has to be both a complete shock, and yet when you think back, it had to happen that way. It was necessary.
It's the blueprint for every great mystery novel, where the killer is revealed and you're stunned, but then you reread the first chapter and you realize, all the clues were right there.
Exactly. That's pure application of his system.
So let's bring this home to ethics, to happiness or eudaimonia. This connects right back to actualizing your potential.
For him, happiness wasn't a fleeting feeling. It's a state of being you achieve through virtuous activity. It's the result of seeing yourself reflected in things you do outside of yourself, creating something, governing wisely, thinking deeply, and unhappiness. Well, unhappiness is the feeling of wasted potential.
A feeling that you haven't been able to move from potentiality to actuality.
Which means the state, the polis, has a profound moral duty to create the conditions where its citizens can actually flourish and fulfill their potential. It's not just about keeping people safe, it's about helping them live a good life.
But to really get his idea of a good life, we have to understand his final brilliant distinction between two kinds of activities.
This is his real roadmap to sustainable happiness. First, you have what he calls motion, heriket. These are activities with a defined endpoint. They stop when the goal is reached. Searching for your keys is motion. You find them, the searching is over. Building a house is motion. You finish the house, the building stops.
And the second kind?
He calls it actuality, or a complete action. These activities are different. They are whole in every moment. They contain their own end within themselves. Seeing, for example, or understanding, or being happy. You don't half-see something. The act of seeing is always complete. The moment you understand an idea, that understanding is total.
So a life of fulfillment is one grounded in those complete activities.
Precisely. Activities like playing the piano or speaking another language or just having a deep conversation, they aren't aimed at a goal that makes them disappear. Their reward is in the doing. And that realization that some activities provide a kind of infinite return, that's his timeless guide to a meaningful life.
As we wrap this up, we have to say so many of the scientific details, the split cosmos, the aether, the four elements, they were wrong.
They were factually incorrect, yes. But they weren't illogical. They were derived from a powerful, consistent set of assumptions. His wrongness was systematic, which is exactly why it held on for 2,000 years. You have to understand his system to see just how revolutionary Galileo, Kepler, and Newton really were. They weren't just correcting facts, they were proposing a whole new way of knowing.
But the philosophical core of his work, Potentiality and Actuality, the pursuit of a virtuous life through complete actions, that feels as relevant today as it ever was. It's practically a personal development guide.
And that framework leads us, I think, to three fundamental fields where humans consistently find that kind of meaning, where we can step outside ourselves. It doesn't matter your culture or your beliefs. Those fields are nature, art, and love.
Those are the experiences where we move from potential to actual most completely.
They are the three pillars. But because they are so spiritually powerful, because they connect us to something bigger than ourselves so instantly, they're also incredibly easy to manipulate. And maybe that's the final thought. If we are seeking a genuine, meaningful life, we have to be vigilant. We have to guard against those who would corrupt or exploit these three essential sources of human fulfillment for their own ends. That vigilance is maybe the highest virtue of all.